Welcome to the Biblically Discerning Podcast, where we seek to have intentional and thoughtful conversations about theology and life. We want to walk in truth and grace the way that God designed us to live. So with that said, let's get into this week's podcast. Welcome back to another week here. I got Leia here. We were just talking about money and ministry. So this is not going to be the third week of the biblical hermeneutics class. That'll be coming out a little bit later this week. But I was just talking with Leia about some of my, not issues, but what I've been wrestling with in going into full-time ministry or bivocational or not while I'm in seminary or after, what have you. And one of my issues is the security of, or the, I guess you would say, false security of a paycheck in a secular job, where you work and you get the paycheck each week or every other week, whatever. And having to rely on God to provide in a ministry job, we'll say like a pastor. Yes, they're probably getting their paycheck, 2 paychecks, every month, every other week. But they also have to rely on God to provide because, one, they're most likely not getting as much as they would if they were in a secular job, unless they're, in their big mega church or something like that.
Which bears its own issues.
But they also have to, I don't know. What was I saying earlier?
Having to trust God for your paycheck, whereas in a secular job, you tend to lose sight of that and tend to think of yourself as providing for your own needs.
That's what it is. Because with a ministry job, you're reliant on the congregation to give to the church in order for you to be able to stay there full time and not have to get either another job or quit completely and go full time.
Or have like a spouse or family member support you, that kind of thing. I'm moving it. Sorry. Zach is giving me stage directions as we speak.
The mic was, if anyone knows anything about audio, it was, arm length away. Thinking
it was not arm length away.
It was half your arm.
I moved it away because you were speaking and I didn't bring it all the way back yet.
Anyway, see, that's much better if you look at the levels.
Thank you.
Much more comparable. Anyway, back on topic. So with you're relying on the congregation if you're in a church setting. If you're a missionary, you're reliant on the people that give to you specifically. If you're doing something like the Navigators, where you have to do your own funding. Because I think the International Mission Board, they provide your funding.
I'm not sure. I think it depends. For some of them, I want to say that they are partial. So they'll fund you. Sorry, it's right there.
You'll see the difference first. So,
all right, I see it here. And I see it here. Okay, I see the point. We can edit that out. Anyway.
No, we won't. I think it's important to the story.
It's important to the story that you're showing me how my form changes your job.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Anyway. I'm not entirely sure. I've never gone through the International Missions Board. I just remember Thomas and Catherine having to deal with it a little bit. For reference, Thomas and Catherine are my brother and his wife. Anyway, but I think it varies. But I think you are correct that they will, at least on a basic level,
help
support.
Yeah.
I think vital needs.
Okay. All right. So you're reliant because you see who is giving, and at any point they could have something happen to them that they just can't, and they have to stop, and so that affects you. Whereas at your job, it's heavily reliant on the work that you do, but it's also reliant on how the company is doing as a whole if they're going to, lay you off. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't think about that because you can go get another job afterwards most of the time.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Is whether or not to enter full-time ministry independently, meaning with no other income, or to do so bivocationally so that he can still reach some sort of internally motivated minimum for supporting our family, or if he should forego any formal type of ministry altogether, work in the workforce, and then act ministerially toward either coworkers and community as a believer.
Yeah. And my thought process through those three options was kind of trying to bring it back to what did the original believers do, the apostles?
The OG Christians?
Yeah, like most of them, if not all, I don't know for sure, they had to do either bivocational or they just worked.
Yeah, for the majority, I believe that they simply lived and worked and worshipped in the community in which they lived. You had the outliers like Paul, who traveled around and spread the gospel and created new churches, who did what the original people did, which was lived and worked and worshipped in that local community. And so that's why Paul moved around, checked on people, planted new churches. His role in Christianity was different. He was a different part of the body. And so obviously the local pastor's role is different than Paul's role.
Yeah.
And Paul was saying that, hey, I came to you, I traveled, I don't live in this community, I don't work here. Sometimes he did. He would just work, on the side, like making tents or whatever. But he'd say, hey, a worker's worth his wages. I have a right to ask for support from you, but I didn't use that right. And then a lot of his ministry, he was actually supported in prison.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it actually ended up being a super helpful thing for Christians everywhere and throughout time that Paul ended up in prison. I doubt Paul even knew the full ramifications of what that time would do, because it essentially forced him to write letters to the churches from prison because he could not go and see them. And so as a result, not only did they get that instruction and he had full time devoted to writing letters, but then we get those letters, And so God had purpose in making sure those things were written down versus just passed down orally, because then you can end up with a lot of deviation over time.
Right. Which is a whole different subject.
Sorry, I got way off topic. I just pointing out, Paul was in a very different aspect of ministry, and depending on where you are in the body of Christ, whether or not you are a local believer acting in ministry in your church and in your local community, or if you're an overseas missionary or a traveling preacher, it changes, I think, how you approach your source of income.
Yeah. Because a missionary, majority of the time, they are just moving locations and doing a regular old secular job. I think that's often misplaced because of all the short-term mission trips where it's
you're going and building a school.
Building a school, doing like a week-long VBS with kids or something like that. Whereas normally like long-term missionaries, they're working in the community that they're in, and they work from there.
Yeah, this is going to sound weird. My sister's sister, so on her dad's side, she and her husband went to Germany for 2 or 3 years. And while they were there, they worked. And then eventually they had a son, so she was a stay-at-home mom in that community and worked in this very post-Christian culture, which is interesting because this is a post-Christian culture that you can work in and be a stay-at-home mom in and all of these things.
Yeah.
It's just where they felt called to.
Something, again, we're off topic, but before I get back on topic, something that one of the navigators from HBU talked about was, was it him? It was either him or a worship leader of mine at the old church that I went to, where are you doing what you're doing if you were to go overseas? Like, what's so special about going overseas? Are you successful in what you're doing here now? And if you're not, why would that change going to a different place where it have a different culture, different location, different issues? You're adding more issues, and yet you're already failing where you are and where you grew up.
Yeah.
And so that's something I thought it was a really good, important thing.
Yeah, a statement I saw one day that I was like, oof, that is a solid burn on most Christians. It said, pills that are hard to swallow. And then it cut scene to the next one's like, if you are unwilling to share your faith or the gospel now in comfort, you are never going to be able to when under any sort of duress. And I was like, ooh, burn.
Anyway, back on topic to money.
Back to the money.
As money is a root of all evil.
Of all kinds of evil. The love of money, sir.
The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. I don't know what I was going with that. It's mainly, I think it is important to know that a laborer is worth his wages. So if you can, you should be able to. And I think one of the thoughts that I had earlier was, well, God knew when I was going to be made and what time and in what location and all that. So who's to say that he didn't do that knowing that I'd wrestle with this and not have to choose between a secular job and a ministry job? I could just go full vocational.
I mean, yeah, for sure. But it's always a dangerous game when you start playing mind games with God. It's like, did you know that I know that you knew that you were going to place me here, and you knew that I knew that I would think that you were placing me in this time for this reason? Like, it gets really, really convoluted when you start doing that kind of thing.
I think it is important to note, like, he didn't put me in a different time.
Oh yeah, for sure it is. But
not
don't
to go
try
too far.
Yeah, don't delve too far into those games. You'll psych yourself out.
Yeah. I think it's also, I think another point on the thing is being able to trust God. Because that was something I looked forward to when I was going to go overseas for 2 years, was being able to trust God with everything. Because I was going to have to raise support 100% to go over to New Zealand for a couple of years. And it didn't end up working out for issues back at home.
Yeah, some girl he wanted to marry or something. I don't know.
Oh, other stuff as well.
I know it was other stuff, but I always got to throw that in there.
But I really missed out on that aspect, because I was really looking forward to being able to surrender and actually really trust God with finances, which is something that I'm very, very good at. Controlling and good at.
You are good at it, absolutely. But I think,
which I guess is prideful, but I try to
manage. I can tell you objectively.
Very tight with money, with where it goes, how it goes, how to grow it, stuff like that. And so being able to be in a position where, one, I would probably be making less, two, having to support a family, and then three, relying heavily on God to provide. I think it'd be a good lesson, but maybe not a necessary. I don't think it's something you should force yourself to be put through.
Well, I think that's true with all kinds of lessons. Like, obviously, if it is necessary, good, morally right to do, you should not be afraid of trial, right? Obviously. But God is going to teach you what he wants to teach you in his time. Don't try to do God's job for him and put yourself through all kinds of trouble for character development whenever it's not necessary. Suffering is not inherently good. In fact, human suffering was never intended to happen. And
suffering is good for the soul.
I mean, yes, it does bring about maturity. That's true. But again, suffering for purpose is important. And where is it? Paul's talking to somebody's like, if you suffer, it should not be as swindlers or cheaters or any kind of troublemaker. But if you suffer for those things, then it's due punishment. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, that is admirable. So the point is not to suffer in order to grow. The point is to do good in spite of the potential or reality of suffering. That is what is good. And I think that's an important distinction. People try to force lessons that they see other people do because they like the results, instead of just dealing with whatever lesson God has given them to deal with at the time. Because it turns out God's gonna teach you, and you got to pay attention to what he's doing in your life instead of trying to mimic what that great believer did in their life.
That's a good point. Because I often saw missionaries, come a lot of testimonies of people that go on mission trips, longer term mission trips, that they completely change, like character, maybe personality a little bit. Doesn't have to, but character a lot of, and then their relationship and faith grew a lot, and I always envied that. So part of the Navigators thing, I think, was to put myself through that, because I wanted that kind of result. And God said, no.
Again,
not in my house.
Desiring the greater gifts is something that's encouraged. You should desire spiritual gifts in your life. You should desire maturity. Absolutely. I'm not saying don't go on a mission trip, because obviously God hasn't planted you there. If that's what God's calling you to do, and he keeps tugging on your heart in that direction, then you should do it. But again, don't do it because you're jealous of the experience. Do it because that's the good God's calling you to do, even if it causes suffering. You see how you're trying not to put the cart before the horse? Yeah,
and that was another part of the reason I didn't end up wanting to go was it was geared a lot towards the experience. One, I personally made it that way, and then two, the organization made it that way, and not geared toward who you're supposed to be ministering to. I know that that was highly important. That was the ultimate purpose, but it was more advertised to get you excited about the experience that you're about to receive.
So it's almost a selfish view of the trip rather than a God and others focused view.
And it could have been my own perspective just being bad, and that was what I was getting in on. It was both for being there for the people, but also I wanted that experience. Because that was one of the reasons I ended up not going, along with other reasons. But
yeah, and I think those are good things to always be checking yourself with, even living and working, doing a secular job. If you're not called to ministry, you should be constantly evaluating your heart, as far as pride of life and the deceitfulness of youth, all those things, because the reality is you could be in a debilitating car wreck and become a quadriplegic tomorrow. You could have an aneurysm and become, a vegetable while you sleep tonight. Your spouse could die and leave you with several children to care for on your own, just at any moment. The provisions that we take for granted in our life are, in fact, given to us by God. And actually seeing the things that you have as gifts to you from the Lord that you are responsible for using well, I think is a very important perspective to keep in mind at all times, because it's really easy to fall in love with money for money's sake and not think about where it's actually coming from. And I'm going to go ahead and confess being guilty of that myself, because I often place far too high an amount of security on myself, because I feel competent and capable of taking care of myself. And that's not really true. Because again, any of those things could happen to me. I could become incapable of caring for myself. I'm a nurse. I'm hireable anywhere, but you never know. Errors could happen, or my license could get revoked for a technicality and random stuff, and all of a sudden I can't provide for myself or for anyone else. I could get injured. I could have any number of things happen to me. And the Lord is the one who directs my life, who directs the steps that I am able to take. I'm responsible for walking through the things that he gives me, But it's important not to lose sight of the fact that there are things that he's giving me, you know?
Yeah. Realizing he's, again, sovereign over all, and it's not just being in a ministry position to where it's more in your face that he's in control of how you're going to live, pretty much. Where in a secular job, anything could happen at any point. I'm just thinking about the many times I've driven to and from different military bases for jobs, and there's just been lots and lots of close calls on like accidents that have happened, just either in front of me, behind me, almost with me, that didn't happen. And it's like, wow, grace of God.
I think that awareness is one of the things that breeds humility and gratitude in us. And those things are necessary for developing love and trust for God. And again, that's part of your maturity and your faith, is learning to love and trust God. I think that's one of the reasons that the gospel and the church tend to thrive so much whenever there's persecution or struggle, is because it makes the whole church acutely aware of the fact that they are entirely dependent on God, whereas they tend to forget that whenever there's prosperity.
I'd also say it weeds out the non-committed.
We got the what?
Non-committed, non-believers, the ones that are just churchgoers.
Oh.
It weeds them out.
It does, yeah.
Because if it's not, I think we've talked about that before, where if it's not benefiting them, then they leave.
Yeah, the fair weather friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And having a biblical perspective on your life, I think, helps. Sorry, I'm bringing the mic up. It helps to help you not be bitter with God when things do go bad in your life. Because if you truly believe God's promises, the hope that we have in the future, that this is not the end. Like if I die tomorrow, it's not the last time I'm going to see you. You and I are going to, again, provided that you're not lying to me about your faith. You never know. You and I are going to live.
Question it all the time.
Oh my gosh, stop. But you and I and the rest of God's people are going to live and work and play together in heaven for eternity. We have such a short-sighted view of this life. We act as though if we don't get every good thing now, then somehow God is ripping us off. But the truth is, it's better to go through suffering here and come to know the Lord and experience eternity with Him and His people.
Don't go through purposefully sought out suffering, though. Like suffering because you want to.
No,
because
yeah,
you think it's
that's
good.
Just like flagellation.
Because I do that sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm like, I have to be suffering because if I'm not, then I'm not saved, or etc.
No, like it's not good to suffer, but if you do, endure it and grow from it. It's kind of like,
I
don't know, illness. It's not good to be sick, but if you are sick and your immune system fights it off, it's then stronger for the next go around because
most of the time
it learns and adapts. Yeah, most of the time, all things being equal. And so it doesn't mean that you should go around, huffing people with flu sneezes. Like that's just foolish.
Yeah.
Doesn't.
Hey, do you have flu?
Gotta get me some of that. No, that's silly. But if you are sick, it's good to, hydrate, rest, get through it, and let your immune system fight it off and be stronger for it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but having a good view of why we're here, I think, puts suffering into perspective. Because if you actually view your existence here as a temporary service to those who are around you, it's a lot simpler to view suffering. Because I'm like, if I suffer, but it gives me the opportunity to share the gospel with someone and they believe, it is worth it for me to have lived for that one person to come with me and be with me in eternity.
Yeah.
I think about that often when I think about the couple people that I've known who I've shared the gospel with who got saved. And I'm like, even if I die tomorrow, it will have been worth it for me to have lived so I can see them one day in eternity.
I think that's a good way to end.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty solid.
It is. I'm not sure how it directly relates to finance, but I guess
because it's what you're doing with a lot of your time. A lot of your life is work, right?
yeah, the
And
coming and going of money.
So it pretty easily, I think, gets into there. Because what are you doing with your work? And they all heard it, so they know how it went.
And it's true with your money too. Like, is your life about amassing wealth, or is it about
Amassing the kingdom.
Exactly. Because who cares if you gain the whole wide world and lose your soul? Or worse, if you saved your own soul and then spent the rest of your life trying to make money and didn't touch anyone else. I find it unlikely that you would do that if you were actually saved, but
That's
either way,
another-
it stands.
Yeah. Yeah. What you chasing is the question.
Not sure if this helped you with your quandary at all.
Meh. Like, I'm still in the same boat pretty much of I'm not entirely sure, and I'm really just leaving it up to God to allow opportunities to come up to give me either vocational, bi-vocational, nothing.
Perhaps this indecision and struggle is so that someone else out there can hear you reason through it and
weep.
find an answer. Perhaps the suffering is for others, dear.
Sure.
Sure.
Cool.
Cool.
And that's how we're gonna end.
Alrighty. Will you pray, babe?
Father God, thank you for the time to just sit down and talk about the resources that you've given us. Money is one of those resources. Time is another, and so many other things that you've given us. Help this to be a way to understand how to use money and what to do with our lives in order to glorify you and bring more into your kingdom. Give us wisdom and humility and understanding on how to go about it. In Jesus' name, amen.